The echo of Max's 3 barks still lingered in the courtroom like a haunting memory. Though silence had returned, the tension refused to dissipate. Everyone's eyes moved between the dog, the little girl, and the defendant who now sat rigid in his chair. The air was so thick with unease that even the ceiling fans, whirring faintly above, seemed to hesitate. Judge Raymond Callahan, known for his iron grip over courtroom order, sat frozen for several moments. His stern expression had always commanded respect, but in that instant, it betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He prided himself on his ability to interpret human behavior lies, fear, arrogance, but never had he been forced to consider the instincts of an animal in the pursuit of justice. The prosecutor shuffled his papers nervously, unsure of how to proceed after such an interruption. The defense attorney smirked faintly, hoping the judge would use this incident to have the dog removed. And the jury, caught between curiosity and disbelief, leaned forward as though witnessing the beginning of an unexpected subplot in a case that was already infamous. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of irritation. "Miss Carter," he addressed the little girl directly, his tone softer than expected but firm. "Control your animal. This is a courtroom, not a circus." Emily's cheeks flushed crimson. Her grip on Max's collar tightened, but her voice trembled as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. He wasn't trying to cause trouble." Her eyes darted toward the defendant, and quickly back down to her lap, as though even acknowledging Max's target might make matters worse. Max, however, refused to bow to the pressure of silence. Though quiet now, his gaze never wavered from the defendant. His posture was alert, every muscle coiled with a readiness that unsettled more than one person in the jury box. The defense attorney seized the moment. Rising smoothly from his chair, he adjusted his suit and addressed the court with mock politeness. "Your Honor, while I respect the emotional needs of the witness, I must insist that this animal be removed. Its behavior is disruptive and clearly prejudicial against my client. This is a court of law, not an obedience class." A murmur of agreement came from a few members of the gallery, though others whispered their dissent. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Sanders," he said, addressing the defense attorney, "I'll be the one to decide what is disruptive in my courtroom." The attorney bowed his head slightly, but the smirk never left his lips. He believed he had scored a point in planting doubt about the dog's presence. Judge Callahan turned his gaze back to the dog. Max stared back, unflinching, almost regal in his composure. The judge didn't believe in nonsense, yet he had witnessed enough human deception in his career to recognize when something unusual demanded attention. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the gavel lightly, not in anger this time, but in thought. "I will allow the animal to remain for now, but one more outburst, and it will be removed. Is that understood?" Emily nodded quickly, whispering a promise to Max that he seemed to ignore. The defendant, however, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The slight crack in his confident facade hadn't escaped the judge's notice. His jaw was tight, his hands restless, fingers tapping against the table. For the first time, his composure looked fragile, as if the dog's unrelenting stare gnawed at his defenses in a way no lawyer's questions ever had. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to resume. "As I was saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show." But Max's low growl rumbled through the silence, not loud enough to be disruptive, yet unmistakable in its warning. All eyes turned once more to the dog. The prosecutor faltered, unsure whether to continue. The defense attorney chuckled bitterly under his breath. "Your Honor, really?" "Sit down, Mr. Sanders," the judge snapped, his patience thinning. "We will proceed?" Yet even Judge Callahan couldn't ignore the knot of unease tightening in his chest. Why had the defendant's confident smile begun to fade at the exact moment the dog barked? Why did Max's focus remain so intense, so deliberate? The jury noticed too. A woman in the front row of the box leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Did you see the way he looked at him?" Another juror nodded silently, eyes narrowing as they studied the defendant. The defendant tried to compose himself, sitting taller, crossing his arms as though to shrug off the scrutiny. But his leg betrayed him, bouncing lightly under the table. He could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. Judge, jury, reporters, and above all, the dog's unwavering eyes. Judge Callahan rapped his gavel again, this time not out of anger, but to refocus the room. We will not be distracted by speculation. This is a court of evidence and testimony, not theatrics. Let us proceed. Still, his own gaze lingered on Max longer than he intended. He saw in those canine eyes something he couldn't quite define, something beyond instinct, almost as if the dog were silently declaring a truth that no human dared to speak. The prosecutor tried once more to continue, his voice steady this time, though he, too, glanced at Max between sentences. The state will present testimony and evidence that prove the defendant was not where he claimed to be on the night in then. Question. We will demonstrate inconsistencies in his story and present witnesses whose accounts align with the truth. As he spoke, the defendant shifted again, loosening his tie and swallowing hard. Max's head tilted slightly, as though assessing every movement. His tail didn't wag, his ears didn't flick. He was a statue of suspicion, carved out of flesh and fur, pointing to something no one yet dared name. When the prosecutor concluded, the defense attorney stood to deliver his opening remarks. He launched into a confident speech about presumption of innocence, unreliable witnesses, and the dangers of emotion clouding judgment. His words were sharp, rehearsed, designed to dismantle the prosecution's case before it could fully take shape. But while he spoke, the jury's attention drifted, not to him, not to his client, but to the dog lying calmly, yet alert at the little girl's side. It was as though Max had become an unspoken witness, one whose testimony couldn't be cross-examined, yet weighed heavily in the minds of everyone present. Judge Callahan noticed the shift. His instincts told him that something irreversible had occurred the moment Max barked. The trial was no longer just about evidence and testimony. It was about perception. And perception, in a jury trial, could be just as powerful as proof. The defense attorney's words grew sharper, louder, as if he sensed his hold on the jury slipping. But the more passionately he argued, the more Max's eyes drilled into his client, and the more the defendant's mask of confidence cracked. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, catching the light, betraying his unease. When the defense finally sat down, the room was left buzzing with unspoken questions. Nobody dared voice them aloud, but everyone thought the same thing. Why had the dog reacted only to him? A judge cleared his throat, signaling the next phase of the trial. But as he shuffled his notes, his mind wandered. He had seen countless defendants over his career, guilty men who smiled like saints, innocent men who trembled like liars. He trusted evidence above all else. Yet here, in his courtroom, was a silent witness who could not be ignored. And though Callahan would never admit it to the gallery, to the jury, or even to himself, a seed of doubt had been planted in his mind, a doubt that no legal argument could erase. The air inside the county courthouse was thick with tension, as if the building itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. It was one of the most publicized trials the state had seen in years, drawing reporters, legal experts, and curious citizens who managed to secure a seat in the packed gallery. Every pew was filled, and the sound of hushed voices buzzed like bees, echoing faintly off the tall, wood-paneled walls. At the center of it all sat the Honorable Judge, Raymond Callahan, a man known for his strict adherence to order and procedure. Callahan's reputation stretched far beyond the small city. He was the kind of judge who tolerated no nonsense in his courtroom. When he spoke, his words carried the sharpness of a gavel strike. When he raised his brow, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Lawyers both feared and respected him, knowing one misstep could earn them a lecture in front of everyone present. As the clock struck 9, Judge Callahan entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him, and the bailiff's booming voice called the session to order. The scrape of chairs and the shuffle of papers filled the next moment as everyone settled into their roles. The jury leaned forward expectantly, their faces a mix of curiosity and stern focus, while the prosecution and defense adjusted their files in preparation for the first statements of the day. Among the crowd, however, was one unusual figure. Little girl no more than 9 years old, seated quietly in the front row reserved for witnesses. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her knuckles betrayed a nervous tremble. Beside her, resting on the floor with his golden coat gleaming in the morning light, was a dog Max, a 4-year-old golden retriever with calm eyes that seemed far wiser than his years. Max wasn't just a pet. He was the girl's service animal, and his presence inside the courtroom had been granted through a special motion filed weeks earlier. The judge, though reluctant at first, had allowed it after hearing about the girl's fragile emotional state and how the dog had been trained to support her through traumatic experiences. Still, many in the room glanced curiously toward the animal, some even disapprovingly. A dog in a courtroom was rare, nearly unheard of, and more than one attorney had muttered under their breath about unnecessary distractions. The little girl, whose name was Emily Carter, sat silently, her hand resting on Max's back. The warmth of his fur grounded her, keeping her calm in a room that otherwise felt like a hostile arena. She knew eyes were on her, though she tried not to notice. All she cared about was Max's steady breathing and the way he seemed to know, instinctively, when she needed reassurance. As the trial began, the prosecutor stood tall and began his opening remarks, his voice deliberate, crafted, for both the jury and the journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. He spoke of truth, of justice, and of the importance of courage in uncovering what truly happened on the night of the crime. His words flowed smoothly, confident and rehearsed, painting a picture of a case built on solid ground. The defense attorney, sitting across the room, wore a smug grin. He tapped his pen lazily against his notes, as though the prosecution's confidence amused him. His client, the defendant, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, sat with his hands folded, projecting an air of calm defiance. He had been in this position before, many whispered, and he knew how to present himself to a jury. His suit was pressed, his hair neatly combed, and his expression carefully composed to convey innocence. For several minutes, everything moved, according to the expected rhythm of a trial. The judge nodded occasionally, making notes. The jury listened intently, occasionally glancing between the attorneys and the defendant. Emily sat quietly, Max resting his head on her lap. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until it happened. Without warning, Max's head shot up, his ears perked sharply, and his body tensed as if struck by an invisible jolt. His eyes fixed on the defendant across the room, and in the next heartbeat, he barked. 1 bark, 2 barks, 3 barks. Each one echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, reverberating off the wooden walls and startling everyone present. The sound broke the flow of the prosecutor's sentence, leaving his words hanging unfinished in the air. Jurors jumped in their seats. Reporters nearly dropped their pens. A woman in the gallery let out a startled yelp. The judge slammed his gavel down hard. Order! Order in the court! But the damage had already been done. Emily clutched Max's collar, her small hands trembling. Max, she whispered desperately, but Max refused to budge. His gaze remained locked on the defendant, his golden eyes unblinking, his body stiff with focus. All around the room, whispers broke out. Why did the dog bark? What's going on? Did you see how he looked at the defendant? The air buzzed with curiosity and confusion, every person trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The defendant shifted uneasily in his chair, his confident composure cracking ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since the trial began, his eyes darted nervously away. Judge Callahan's face was a mask of irritation, though beneath it flickered something else: curiosity. He rapped his gavel again, harder this time. Silence. The room fell quiet, though the tension remained as thick as smoke. The judge turned his gaze toward Emily and Max, his eyes narrowing. Young lady, control your dog. This is a courtroom, not a kennel. Emily's cheeks burned red, and tears welled in her eyes. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could, her attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, with all due respect, Max isn't just a dog. He's a trained service animal, and his reactions are not random. The judge's brow arched. Are you suggesting this courtroom proceed under the guidance of an animal? A ripple of laughter broke out among the gallery, quickly silenced by another strike of the gavel. I'm suggesting, the attorney said firmly, that Max may have detected something significant. And if the truth is what we're all here for, then perhaps we shouldn't dismiss what just happened. The judge studied the attorney for a long moment, then glanced back at Max, who sat quietly once more. Though his posture remained rigid, his eyes still locked on the defendant. The dog's silence now felt heavier than his barks, an unspoken message lingering in the air. For the first time, the trial had been derailed not by an objection, not by evidence, but by 3 sharp barks that seemed to pierce deeper than words ever could. And though the judge wouldn't admit it aloud, a thought crossed his mind, a thought he quickly buried beneath his stern expression. What if the dog knew something no one else did? The courtroom was a storm of whispers and exchanged glances after Max's sudden outburst. Judge Callahan, though stern, couldn't deny the strange pull this animal had cast over the proceedings. The gavel had already been struck several times, yet the invisible weight of those 3 sharp barks lingered in the air. Emily sat pale and trembling, her fingers curled protectively into Max's golden fur. She wished more than anything that Max hadn't barked, yet she knew deep inside this wasn't random. Max never barked without reason. Not at home, not in public, and especially not in places where he understood silence was required. The defense attorney, Sanders, smirked and rose again. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is absurd. We cannot allow a courtroom to descend into chaos because of an animal's bark. It is prejudicial, it is irrelevant, and frankly, it undermines the dignity of this court. His words cut sharply through the room, and a few heads in the gallery nodded. But before the judge could respond, Emily's attorney, Claire Whitman, stood abruptly. Her presence was a contrast to Sanders' arrogance. Tall, poised, with a calmness that masked her fire, Claire was known for her ability to turn skepticism into belief. She stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. Your Honor, before this court dismisses what just happened, I believe it's important for everyone to understand Max is not an ordinary pet. He's a certified service animal. His reactions are not accidents, nor are they meaningless. This dog is trained to detect emotional distress, and more importantly, dishonesty. The gallery buzzed with excitement. Reporters scrambled to jot down her words. The jury exchanged glances, some leaning closer, intrigued. Sanders scoffed. What's next, counsel? Shall we call the dog to the stand and have him take an oath? Laughter rippled softly from the back row, but the judge's gavel slammed down hard. Order, Judge Callahan snapped. He fixed Sanders with a glare sharp enough to silence him. Then he turned to Claire. You're making a serious assertion. Counselor, are you prepared to back it up with facts? Claire nodded. Absolutely, Your Honor. She gestured toward Emily. The little girl shrank slightly under the attention, but squeezed Max's collar as if drawing strength. Claire continued, her voice softening but carrying conviction. Emily suffers from post-traumatic stress following the events tied to this case. Max has been her constant companion for 3 years. He was trained at a certified facility that specializes in service animals for children with trauma. His tasks go beyond comfort. He can sense elevated heart rates, changes in breathing, and chemical shifts in the body that often signal fear or deceit. His alerts have been consistent. He has never been wrong. The courtroom grew silent again. Every word seemed to carve a new layer of gravity into the case. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on his chin. You are saying this dog is capable of detecting deception? Yes, Your Honor, Claire said firmly. And while I don't claim his instincts are legally admissible evidence, I argue that his reactions should not be dismissed as irrelevant. Sanders shot up from his seat again, his voice dripping with mockery. Your Honor, this is pure theatrics. Dogs don't detect lies. If they could, we'd do away with juries and polygraphs entirely. We cannot allow emotional manipulation of this court. But his words didn't land as strongly this time. Too many eyes were on Max, who sat as still as stone, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Sanders' client. His quiet presence seemed louder than Sanders' shouting. Claire seized the opportunity. Your Honor, I understand Mr. Sanders' concerns, but this is not about theatrics. It's about acknowledging that unusual circumstances sometimes reveal truths. I ask the court's permission to let Max remain so that the jury may observe, just as they observe any other behavior within this courtroom. No one here can deny what they saw when Max reacted. The judge paused, his eyes moving from Claire to Emily, then to Max. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant scratching of pens from reporters, eager to capture the judge's next words. At last, Judge Callahan spoke. The dog may remain, but let me be clear, this trial will not devolve into a spectacle. His presence is to support the witness, nothing more. The jury will base its decision on evidence and testimony. Is that understood? Both attorneys nodded, though Sanders' face was red with frustration. Claire allowed herself a small breath of relief, then turned back to Emily, giving her a reassuring nod. Emily bent down and whispered into Max's ear. The dog, as though he understood, laid his head gently across her lap, but kept his eyes firmly locked on the defendant. The tension, though momentarily tempered, had shifted. The jury no longer looked at the case the same way. They had seen the dog react, heard the explanation, and now a seed had been planted in their minds, a seed that might grow into doubt, suspicion, or belief. As the prosecutor resumed his questioning, Max remained silent but alert. Every answer from the defendant drew the jury's eyes not just to the man speaking, but to the animal listening. It was as if a second invisible trial had begun, one where truth was judged not by cross-examination, but by instinct. The defense attorney fumed quietly, but he could not stop the tide. Claire had reframed the interruption not as a disruption, but as an insight. And now, every juror was silently waiting to see if Max would react again. Judge Callahan scribbled a note in his ledger, his jaw tightening. He had spent decades upholding the law, but he had never faced a situation like this. For the first time in his career, he wondered, could justice sometimes be guided by something beyond the rules of procedure? And though he kept his face composed, His mind wrestled with a truth he dared not voice. Max might know more than anyone else in the room. The courtroom, though orderly on the surface, felt like it was balancing on the edge of something unpredictable. Everyone had settled back into their seats, but their minds were no longer focused solely on legal arguments and exhibits. They were watching Max. The golden retriever sat quietly by Emily's side, his posture calm yet alert, as though waiting for the next move in a game only he understood. The prosecutor rose again, shuffling papers deliberately to mask the growing unease that seemed to pulse through the room. He adjusted his glasses and turned toward the defendant. "Mr. Rowland," he began, his tone steady, "I want to revisit your account of the night in question." The defendant, Richard Rowland, forced a faint smile. He had prepared for this moment countless times with his lawyer. He knew his story inside and out. But as soon as he opened his mouth to answer, Max shifted. It wasn't much, just the lift of his head, ears pricking forward, body tightening slightly, but it was enough. The jury noticed. Richard cleared his throat. "As I said before, I was at home that night, alone." The words barely left his mouth when a low growl rolled from Max's chest. Not loud, not disruptive, but audible enough that the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Richard's jaw clenched. He didn't dare look at the dog, but the sound seemed to crawl under his skin. His hands, resting on the table, began to fidget. He tapped his fingers against the wood, trying to mask the nervous energy building inside. "Him." The prosecutor paused, sensing the shift. His eyes flicked toward Max, then back to Richard. "You're certain? Alone? All night?" "Yes," Richard said quickly, his voice sharper now. "I already told you." Max gave another low growl, this one longer, vibrating through the room like a hidden warning. Gasps rose softly from the gallery. One juror bit her lip, leaning forward. Another scribbled something hurriedly in the margin of his notebook. They weren't just listening to the defendant anymore. They were listening to the dog. The judge rapped his gavel once, more out of habit than anger. "Order," he said, though his own gaze betrayed curiosity. He had told himself not to indulge the animal's behavior, but even he couldn't deny the timing. Richard shifted in his seat again. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple, catching the fluorescent light above. His breathing quickened, just slightly, but enough for those watching closely to notice. The prosecutor stepped closer. His voice grew softer, more probing. "Mr. Rowland, are you absolutely sure there's nothing you left out? Nothing you might want to clarify?" Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to snap, to deny again. But every time he opened his mouth, he felt the dog's invisible grip around him. He dared a quick glance toward Emily's corner, and immediately regretted it. Max's amber eyes were locked on him, unblinking, steady as stone. For a moment, it felt as though the entire courtroom had vanished, leaving only him and the dog in some silent duel. I'm sure," Richard stammered finally, his voice breaking. Max gave a sharp huff through his nose, a sound that carried the weight of disapproval. Though it wasn't a bark, the jurors reacted as though it was. A ripple of murmurs spread through them. Sanders, the defense attorney, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We cannot allow this trial to be dictated by the reactions of an animal. It is prejudicial and undermines the very foundation of justice." But his protest sounded weaker this time. Even he had noticed his client's faltering composure. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temple. He wanted to agree, to dismiss the dog's behavior as coincidence, but he couldn't shake the image of Richard's every lie being shadowed by a growl. He tapped his pen against his notes, silently weighing his options. The prosecutor pressed on. "Mr. Rowland, can you explain why, when you speak of being home that night, your demeanor changes? Why you seem nervous?" "I'm not nervous," Richard snapped. Too quickly. The prosecutor tilted his head. "Then why are your hands shaking?" All eyes shifted. Richard froze, realizing too late that his fingers were trembling against the polished surface of the table. He pulled them back, clenching them into fists on his lap. Max let out another low rumble, the sound so perfectly timed that half the jury turned their eyes to the defendant, not the dog. Richard swallowed hard. His tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. He had prepared for cross-examinations, for leading questions, for evidence, but he had never prepared for this. A dog, silent and relentless, dismantling his confidence, with nothing more than presence. Sanders leaned close, whispering something urgently in his ear, but Richard barely heard him. All he could feel was the weight of Max's stare, pressing down like a spotlight. The judge, unable to ignore the mounting tension, finally spoke. "Mr. Rowland, the court reminds you that you are under oath. Any false statements could carry consequences far beyond this trial." Richard nodded stiffly, his throat bobbing, as he tried to swallow the dryness. I understand." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted away from the judge, away from the prosecutor, away from the jury, always avoiding the one place his instincts told him never to look. Yet he couldn't resist for long. His gaze flicked once more toward Max. The dog hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, his head slightly tilted, his eyes unwavering. There was no hostility in his face, no teeth bared, only certainty. And that certainty cut deeper than any accusation could. The jury felt it. The gallery felt it. Even Judge Callahan, as hardened as he was, felt the unshakable truth settling in the room. Something about Richard's story wasn't right. The prosecutor, sensing the moment, stepped back. He didn't need to push harder. Not yet. The cracks had begun to show. The dog had done what cross-examination often struggled to accomplish. It had unsettled the defendant in front of everyone. The judge finally called for a recess, his gavel striking 3 sharp times. "Court will reconvene in 15 minutes, he declared. His voice carried authority, but his mind was spinning. He had never allowed instinct to interfere with law, yet here he was, privately admitting that a dog had shifted the trial in ways no lawyer could. As the courtroom emptied into the hallways, the jurors whispered among themselves, their faces grave. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded, as though confirming what they had already suspected. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his once polished confidence unraveling thread by thread. Sanders leaned close again, hissing in his ear, but Richard barely listened. His eyes flicked once more to Emily and Max, who hadn't moved from their corner. The little girl stroked Max's fur gently, her lips close to his ear. "Good boy," she whispered. And for the first time, Richard felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the courtroom was no longer a place of rules and arguments, but a battlefield where his lies were being hunted, one growl at a time. The 15-minute recess had done little to ease the tension. If anything, it only made the weight of the trial heavier. Jurors returned with hushed conversations, still hanging on their lips. The gallery buzzed with speculation, and even the court clerks seemed unusually alert. At the defense table, Richard Rowland sat stiffly, his jaw locked, his hands folded so tightly they had turned pale. His attorney Sanders whispered in his ear again, urging composure, reminding him of the script they had rehearsed for weeks. But Richard barely nodded. He couldn't shake the eyes that had followed him into recess, not the eyes of the jury, not the judges, and certainly not the unblinking amber gaze of the golden retriever sitting calmly beside the little girl. Emily had not moved since recess began. She stroked Max's ears gently, her small frame leaning into the dog as if the entire world outside the two of them didn't exist. Max, however, was alert, his nose twitching, his chest rising and falling. with quiet, steady breaths. To anyone watching, he looked calm. But to Richard, the dog's presence felt suffocating, a constant reminder that his every word was being measured by something deeper than law. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. Court is now back in session. Judge Callahan entered, his black robe swaying as he took his seat. His gavel struck once, crisp and sharp. Please be seated. The prosecutor wasted no time. He rose, his movements deliberate, and faced Richard with a calm intensity that bordered on predatory. Mr. Rowland, he began, before we recessed, you testified once again that you were home, alone, on the night of May 12th. Is that correct? Richard straightened. Yes, that's correct. The words came out too quickly, too defensively. And then it happened. From Emily's corner, Max suddenly stood up, his body tense. His ears flattened slightly, his chest expanded, and then, bark. The first bark rang out, sharp and commanding, startling the room into silence. Bark. The second came almost immediately, louder, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Several jurors flinched. One woman pressed her hand against her chest. Bark. The third was the loudest, reverberating through the courtroom like a thunderclap. It was not aggression. It was a declaration. The sound of certainty. The courtroom froze. Even Judge Callahan's gavel hovered midair, forgotten. Richard's face drained of color. He tried to sit still, tried to maintain composure, but his lips trembled. The barks seemed to hit him like physical blows, breaking down the walls he had built brick by brick. The prosecutor's eyes gleamed with opportunity. Interesting timing, he said softly, his voice measured but cutting. He took a step forward. Mr. Rowland, are you sure you want to continue with that answer? Sanders leapt to his feet. Objection. This is absurd, Your Honor. The court cannot allow an animal to dictate the proceedings. But his voice lacked conviction. He, too, had felt the electricity in the air when Max barked. The judge hesitated, his brow furrowing. He knew Sanders had a point. By the book, the dog's behavior had no place in testimony. And yet, his own instincts told him something. Far different. The timing of those barks was too exact, too purposeful to dismiss as coincidence. Finally, he lowered the gavel. Objection noted, he said slowly, but overruled. The jury will decide what weight, if any, to give the matter. The jurors exchanged looks. Some nodded slightly, others scribbled furiously in their notebooks. But one thing was certain. They were all paying attention now, in a way they hadn't before. Richard's breathing grew ragged. He shifted in his seat, pulling at his collar as though it had tightened around his neck. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Richard brushed him off with a shaky hand. His eyes darted toward Max, then quickly away again. The prosecutor pressed in. Mr. Rowland, I'll ask you again. Where were you on the night of May 12th? I told you, Richard stammered, his voice cracking. I was at home. Max let out a low growl, deep and resonant. Not loud enough to draw objection this time, but enough to ripple across the room. The jurors' eyes locked onto Richard. It was no longer just his word against evidence. It was his word against something unspoken, but undeniable. The dog's. Judgment. The prosecutor leaned closer. His tone grew softer, almost coaxing. Mr. Rowland, maybe it would be easier if you told us who you were with that night, or where you went before you returned home. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. His mind screamed to stick to the story, to stay firm, but his body betrayed him. His hands trembled, his leg bounced under the table, sweat pooled at his hairline. He looked less like an innocent man defending himself, and more like a trapped animal. Sanders slammed his fist lightly against the table. Don't answer that, he barked at his client. Stay with what we prepared. But Richard couldn't. The silence stretched on too long. The jury leaned forward, hungry. Finally, his voice cracked through the air, brittle and strained. I might have stepped out for a while. Just for a short time. The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Jurors' pens flew across their notepads. Even Judge Callahan's expression hardened. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? That's not what you said before." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I forgot. It was late. I was home most of the night, but I stepped out for air, just for a little while." Max stood taller now, his tail rigid, his eyes unblinking. He didn't bark again, but the silence carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Mr. Rowland, this is the first time you've admitted leaving your home that night. Isn't it true you weren't alone? Isn't it true you met someone? Perhaps even followed them?" "Objection." Sanders thundered, his face flushed. "Speculation, badgering the witness." "Overruled," Judge Callahan said firmly. His voice carried a new edge, sharper than before. "The witness will answer." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for breath. He wanted to deny, to return to the safety of the script, but the ground beneath him had shifted. The jurors' eyes bore into him. Max's presence loomed larger than life. And deep down, he knew his lie had already begun to unravel. His voice dropped to a whisper. I wasn't alone the whole night." A stunned silence followed. The prosecutor's pen hovered over his notepad, then slowly came to rest. He didn't need to push further, not yet. The seed of doubt had been planted firmly in the jury's mind. And it hadn't been his questioning that cracked the defendant. It had been the dog. Judge Callahan finally struck the gavel, his voice cutting through the silence. "Court will recess until tomorrow morning." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, speculation swirling like a storm. Reporters scribbled frantically, already preparing their headlines. Jurors filed out slowly, their expressions grave, whispering to each other with newfound certainty. At the defense table, Richard slumped in his chair, pale and hollow. Sanders gripped his shoulder, whispering harshly, but Richard barely heard. His eyes, wide and fearful, remained fixed on the dog across the room. Emily hugged Max tightly, burying her face in his fur. "Good boy," she whispered again, her small voice carrying a warmth the courtroom could not. Max didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Richard, unwavering, relentless. 3 barks had shaken the foundations of the trial, and everyone knew. The truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was clawing its way into the light. The following morning, the courthouse buzzed like a hive under threat. Yesterday's events, 3 loud barks that echoed through every news station in the city, had made this case the most talked-about trial in America. Crowds pressed. Against the courthouse steps, reporters shoved microphones toward anyone who looked like they might know something, and television vans lined the block. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Jurors shuffled in with tired eyes, but sharpened. Attention. They had replayed Richard Rowland's words in their minds overnight. "I might have stepped out. I wasn't alone the whole night." That single crack had opened a canyon of doubt. Emily sat quietly at the side of the courtroom, her small hands folded over Max's golden fur. She whispered into his ear, words only he could hear. Though she was too young to understand the full weight of the legal system, she knew enough. Max had spoken yesterday, and everyone listened. Max lay steady at her feet, but his gaze was fixed straight ahead, unblinking, as though waiting. Judge Callahan entered. His gavel struck once, commanding silence. Court is back in session. The prosecutor rose immediately, his expression calm, but steeled with purpose. "Your Honor, in light of yesterday's testimony, The state intends to recall the defendant for further questioning. Sanders groaned, already on his feet. Your Honor, this is harassment. The defendant was clear in his testimony. Clear? The judge asked, one eyebrow arched. Yesterday, he contradicted himself under oath. Sanders' lips pressed into a thin line. He sat down heavily. Richard Rowland was sworn in again, his hands trembling as he touched the Bible. The courtroom lights felt hotter today, or maybe it was just the sweat forming at his hairline. He lowered himself into the witness chair, trying to regain composure, but it was like sitting inside a furnace. The prosecutor began softly, almost gently. Mr. Rowland, yesterday you told this court you had stepped out of your home on May 12th, even though you previously claimed you were home all night. Can you clarify this for the jury? Richard's eyes darted toward the jury box. 12. Pairs of eyes pierced into him, demanding answers. He cleared his throat. Yes, I remembered later. I stepped out for some air. Just a few minutes. The prosecutor nodded. And where did you go for this air? Richard hesitated. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. I walked down the block. Around the corner. Max lifted his head. His ears pricked forward. The prosecutor leaned closer. Mr. Rowland, isn't it true you didn't simply go for air, but rather followed someone that night? Richard's lawyer leapt up. Objection. Speculation. Counsel is putting words in the defendant's mouth. Judge Callahan hesitated, then said, overruled. The witness may answer. Richard's jaw tightened. He gripped the edges of the chair. No, I didn't follow anyone. Bark. A single sharp bark cracked the silence. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jurors' heads whipped toward the golden retriever, then back at Richard. His face went white. The prosecutor let the moment hang, then said slowly, Interesting. The last time you insisted you were home, the dog barked 3 times. Now, when you deny following someone, he reacts again. Tell me, Mr. Rowland, what is it you're not saying? Sanders slammed his palm against the defense table. This is outrageous. A dog is not a witness. The judge's gavel cracked once. Mr. Sanders, control your tone. The jury will determine the weight of all testimony, human or otherwise. A ripple of shock spread across the gallery. Never in the history of the state had a judge given such leeway to an animal's behavior. But Callahan's eyes were steady. He was not swayed by theatrics. He was swayed by truth. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly. He licked his dry lips. Fine. I left my house. I saw her, all right? The prosecutor froze, his pen hovering. You saw who? Richard's eyes flicked toward Emily, then immediately away. The girl. The one sitting right there. A collective gasp filled the room. Emily tightened her grip on Max's fur. You saw Emily? The prosecutor pressed. Yes, Richard muttered, barely audible. She was outside, playing with the dog. And what did you do? Richard's hands trembled. He clasped them together, trying to still the shaking. Nothing. I just watched for a while. Then I went home. Max let out a low growl, soft but chilling. A prosecutor leaned in. Mr. Rowland, you didn't simply watch. Witnesses have placed your car circling that neighborhood multiple times. Isn't it true you followed Emily and Max? Richard's voice cracked. Sweat trickled down his temple. His eyes darted, searching desperately for rescue, but his attorney stayed silent, powerless against the unraveling truth. Max stood now, his body rigid, his tail stiff. Emily's hand clutched his collar tightly. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Rowland, yesterday you swore under oath that you were home all night. Today you admit leaving. You're home. You admit seeing Emily. Isn't it time you tell this court why you were really there? Richard shook his head violently, his face twisted in panic. I wasn't going to hurt her, he blurted, voice breaking. The gallery erupted into a storm of whispers. The jury leaned forward as if yanked by invisible strings. The prosecutor's voice turned cold. Then why follow her? Why lie about where you were? Why change your story, again and again? Richard buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. For the first time, the mask was gone. What sat in the witness chair was not a confident businessman, not a man in control, but someone broken, cornered, and unraveling before everyone's eyes. Judge Callahan's voice was calm but firm. Mr. Rowland, you will answer the question. Richard's muffled voice slipped through his fingers. I didn't mean for it to happen. The words fell like a stone into deep water. Emily's wide eyes filled with tears. Max pressed closer against her legs, as if shielding her from the weight of Richard's confession. The prosecutor stepped back, his voice quiet now. What didn't you mean, Mr. Rowland? Silence. Richard rocked slightly in his chair, his face pale and drenched with sweat. His lips quivered, but no sound came. The judge finally struck his gavel. We will recess until this afternoon. The courtroom exploded into noise. Reporters scrambled for the exits to feed the breaking story. Jurors exchanged tense whispers. At the defense table, Sanders looked as though his entire case had crumbled in his hands. He tried to speak to Richard, but Richard only stared at the floor, trembling. Across the room, Emily wiped her tears and hugged Max tightly. The golden retriever rested his head against her shoulder, his presence steady and unyielding. To the world, he was a dog. To her, he was a shield. And to the jury, he had become something even greater, a witness to truth that no lie could silence. For Richard Rowland, the walls were closing in. His carefully constructed story had collapsed, piece by piece, under the weight of 3 barks, a growl, and the eyes of 12 jurors, who now saw him not as a wronged man, but as a predator caught in his own web. And the trial was far from over. The courthouse was electric that afternoon. By the time the jury filed back into the box, the story had already gone national. News anchors repeated the same dramatic footage. Richard Rowland trembling on the stand, his voice cracking as he muttered, I didn't mean for it to happen. Across the country, living rooms buzzed with speculation. What had he meant? What truth had slipped through his breaking composure? Inside the courtroom, Judge Callahan struck the gavel sharply, restoring order. The recess had done little to calm the storm. If anything, tension had multiplied. Richard sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, his face pale as chalk. His lawyer, Sanders, whispered furiously, urging him to keep his composure, but Richard stared blankly at the table. He looked more like a man awaiting execution than one fighting for freedom. Emily sat with her guardian, one hand buried deep in Max's golden fur. The retriever was quiet now, but his eyes never left Richard. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The prosecutor rose. His voice was calm, but a note of gravity underscored every word. Your Honor, after this morning's testimony, the state has reviewed additional evidence and spoken with potential witnesses. We would like to call someone new to the stand. Sanders leapt up instantly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has not been given notice of any additional witnesses. This is a trial, not a circus. Judge Callahan's eyes narrowed. Mr. Sanders, you'll recall your client altered his testimony under oath, introducing entirely new circumstances. The state is entitled to rebut. I will allow it. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Everyone leaned forward as the prosecutor turned toward the door. The state calls Mrs. Clara Jennings. A hush fell. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back creaked open. An older woman stepped in slowly, leaning on a cane. She was dressed plainly, a modest gray dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. Emily's guardian gasped softly. Emily herself tilted her head, confused. She didn't recognize the woman. Clara made her way to the stand, each step deliberate. The bailiff helped her up the small stairs, and she placed her hand on the Bible, swearing the oath with steady words. The prosecutor began gently. "Mrs. Jennings, please state your name in relation to this case." "My name is Clara Jennings," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I live on Rosemont Avenue, 2 doors down from Mr. Rowland." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. "A neighbor." The prosecutor nodded. "And Mrs. Jennings, do you recall the evening of May 12th? Clara's hands gripped the rail of the witness box tightly. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Richard, then back to the prosecutor. "Yes, I recall it very well. I couldn't forget it if I tried." Richard's head jerked up for the first time all afternoon. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice sharp with panic. Sanders grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Be quiet." The judge's gavel banged. "Mr. Rowland, you will remain silent." Clara's expression never wavered. "She continued, that night, I was out on my porch, couldn't sleep. I saw Richard Rowland's car drive past twice. The third time, he parked at the end of the street. The courtroom froze. Even the sound of pens scratching had stopped. The prosecutor leaned closer. "And what happened next, Mrs. Jennings?" Clara's voice quivered, but she pressed on. "I saw him get out. He wasn't just out for her. He was watching the little girl playing with her dog." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Emily buried her face into Max's fur. The retriever shifted, pressing closer to her protectively. Richard slammed his fist against the defense table. "Lies!" he roared, his face red. "She's lying. I never—" "Enough!" Judge Callahan thundered. "One more outburst, Mr. Rowland, and I will have you removed." Richard fell. Silent, chest heaving, eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal. The prosecutor's voice lowered, almost gentle again. "Mrs. Jennings, did you see anything else?" Clara swallowed hard. "Yes, I saw him step closer, like he meant to approach her. But the dog growled. Loud enough I could hear it from my porch. That's when Mr. Rowland stopped. He froze, then backed away and got into his car." All eyes turned instinctively toward Max, who lay quietly by Emily's feet. The retriever's calm gaze seemed to echo the testimony. The jury's faces hardened. The image Clara painted was too vivid to ignore. A predator advancing, stopped only by the instinct and bravery of a dog. Sanders scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, this so-called witness is unreliable." An elderly neighbor, sitting in the dark, claiming she saw something across the street? This is nothing but conjecture and misinterpretation. But the damage was done. The jurors were leaning forward, riveted. Some had even glanced toward Emily, with sympathy so deep it cut through the stale air of the courtroom. The prosecutor walked slowly before the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, think carefully. This is not speculation. This is corroboration. Mr. Rowland admitted he left his home. He admitted he saw the girl. And now, an eyewitness places him circling her street, parking nearby and stepping toward her until Max stopped him. He turned, gesturing toward the retriever. And when the defendant denied it, what happened? The dog barked. The same dog Mrs. Jennings describes as warning him away that night. The jurors exchanged glances. The pieces were fitting together too neatly to ignore. Sanders sputtered. "We cannot base a verdict on a dog's reaction." The judge fixed him with a steely gaze. "The verdict will be based on the defendant's own contradictions and the credibility of witnesses." But the jury is free to weigh the circumstances however they see fit. Richard slumped in his chair, his face damp with sweat. His breathing was shallow, his hands twitching against his knees. He looked less like a man defending himself, and more like one unraveling thread by thread. The prosecutor faced Clara once more. "Mrs. Jennings, why have you chosen to come forward now?" Clara's eyes softened. "Because that little girl shouldn't carry this weight alone. I couldn't sleep knowing what I saw. I thought maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe no one would believe me. But then I saw that dog bark in court, and I realized the truth needed to be spoken, even if it's hard." Emily lifted her face. Tears streaked her cheeks, but for the first time in days, a small flicker of hope shone in her eyes. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temple. "The testimony will be entered into record. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel fell. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters bolted for the doors, calling their editors. Jurors shuffled out in silence, the weight of Clara's words heavy on their shoulders. Richard was led away by his lawyer, but he looked hollow, like a man already hearing the clink of prison gates. Emily's guardian wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Max stood tall beside her, his golden coat glimmering in the afternoon light that filtered through the courthouse windows. To Emily, he wasn't just her dog anymore. He was her protector, her voice, and her proof that truth couldn't be silenced. And yet, in the quiet corners of the courthouse, questions lingered. What had Richard meant by, "I didn't mean for it to happen"? What dark intent had driven him that night? Tomorrow, those answers would come. And when they did, the court and the country would never forget what unfolded in that small, tense courtroom. The courthouse was quieter than usual the next morning. A heavy rain had passed through at dawn, leaving the marble steps slick and gleaming, as though the building itself had been scrubbed clean for the final act. Reporters huddled under umbrellas. Outside, their cameras trained on the doors. Inside, anticipation clung to the air like static. Emily sat with her guardian on the wooden bench, Max curled faithfully at her feet. His calm presence was the only anchor in a storm of nerves. She stroked his ears slowly, her young heart pounding as though she were the one on trial. Richard Rowland was led in by deputies. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He no longer carried the proud arrogance he had shown at the beginning. He looked diminished, like a man shrinking under the weight of his own lies. His lawyer Sanders muttered hurried instructions, but Richard didn't respond. He only stared at the floor. Judge Callahan entered, her gavel striking once. "This court will now resume. Prosecution? Defense? Are you prepared for closing arguments?" The prosecutor rose. His face was calm, but his voice held steel. "Yes, Your Honor." He turned to the jury, pacing slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the evidence. You have seen the contradictions." The defendant claimed he was elsewhere that night, until under oath he admitted he followed the child. He claimed he meant no harm, yet a neighbor witnessed him circling her street 3 times, stepping closer until a dog stopped him. Ask yourselves, what innocent man prowls at night, circling the home of a child, then lies until his story crumbles? He paused, letting the silence linger. We are not here to judge possibilities. We are here to weigh actions. And Mr. Rowland's actions reveal intent. Intent to harm, intent to deceive, and intent to escape accountability. But thanks to one brave child, one loyal dog, and one neighbor who found her courage, truth has found its way into this courtroom. He gestured to Max, who lifted his head as though understanding the moment. The bark that shook this court was not random. It was recognition. This dog remembered the danger his girl faced that night. And when the defendant lied, he knew. The jurors leaned forward, their faces grave, drawn into the picture the prosecutor painted. Ladies and gentlemen, justice demands you find Richard Rowland guilty. Guilty of attempted abduction. Guilty of terrorizing a child. Guilty of lying to this court. Do not let his falsehoods outweigh the truth that has spoken louder than words. He sat. Sanders rose quickly, smoothing his tie, his voice defensive. The prosecution would have you believe a story woven from fear and conjecture. But law is not built on feelings. It is built on facts. And what do we have? An old woman who claims she saw something from her porch in the dark. A child too frightened to speak clearly. And a dog that barked, as dogs do. He slammed a hand against the table. We cannot convict a man because a dog barked. We cannot strip a person of freedom based on interpretation and emotion. My client has admitted mistakes, yes, but mistakes are not crimes. He followed a child, foolishly, perhaps, but no harm was done. His words, "I didn't mean for it to happen," have been twisted beyond recognition. Was he reckless? Possibly. But is he guilty beyond reasonable doubt? No. He turned to the jury, his voice lowering. If you convict him today, based on fear and assumption, what stops the next innocent man from being destroyed by suspicion alone? Do not let emotion override justice. He sat down heavily, beads of sweat on his forehead. Judge Callahan nodded. Members of the jury, you will now deliberate. The 12 jurors filed silently into the chamber. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people shifted restlessly. Emily leaned against Max, who rested his head in her lap. She closed her eyes and whispered to him, "Please let them see the truth." Hours dragged on. The gallery emptied and refilled as people came and went. Reporters tapped furiously on laptops. Richard stared at the ceiling, muttering to himself. His lawyer tried to stay composed, but the tension was palpable. Finally, as the clock neared 6, the bailiff stepped forward. All rise. The jury has reached a verdict. The room fell silent. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stood. We, the jury, find the defendant. She paused, glancing toward Richard, then Emily. Guilty on all counts. Gasps filled the courtroom. Emily clutched Max tightly, her tears spilling, this time not of fear, but relief. Richard lurched to his feet. No, this is wrong. You don't understand. I didn't mean to hurt her. I couldn't stop myself. His voice cracked into a wail, years of suppressed truth crashing out at once. Judge Callahan banged her gavel. Order! But Richard was unstoppable now. I watched her. I thought I could control it. I thought no one would know. That dog, that cursed dog, he saw me. He knew. Every time I tried to get closer, he stopped me. He ruined everything. His voice rose to a scream. I never meant for it to go that far, but I wanted to take her. I wanted enough. The gavel slammed again. Deputies rushed to restrain him as the gallery erupted in horrified gasps. Emily buried her face into Max's neck, trembling. But Max stood firm. His eyes locked on Richard with unflinching defiance. Richard's outburst left no doubts. His confession had sealed his fate. Judge Callahan's face was as hard as stone. The jury's verdict stands. Richard Rowland, you are hereby remanded into custody to await sentencing. Bail is revoked. The deputies dragged him away, his shouts echoing off the walls until the heavy doors closed behind him. Silence followed, broken only by Emily's quiet sobs and Max's steady breathing. The judge's voice softened. This court owes gratitude to those who found courage to speak, to Mrs. Jennings, to young Emily, and to her remarkable companion. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. As people began filing out, Emily's guardian knelt beside her. It's over, sweetheart. "You're safe now." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. She hugged Max tightly, whispering into his fur, "You saved me again." Reporters crowded the hallway, their cameras flashing. Headlines would soon blaze. Dog helps convict predator. Child protected by loyal retriever. But inside that courtroom, the story was simpler. It was about truth finding its way through fear, about loyalty stronger than lies, about a golden retriever whose instincts gave voice to the voiceless. As the courthouse emptied, Emily looked down at Max. He wagged his tail, pressing his head into her hands. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. The storm had passed. Justice had spoken. And thanks to one child, one dog, and one judge who dared to listen, the world had witnessed a truth that could never again be silenced.